So like Linda said, we're going to be telling y'all a lot of kind of basics about irrigation auditing. I know y'all are excited to do some math. Everybody brought their calculators, right? So our main goals for this presentation are, number one, to tell you how to conduct an irrigation audit. We're going to go through the steps, we're going to go through the math, and then once we do that, what are you going to do when you get the results? There's a lot of different reasons why your irrigation system might not work correctly, so we're going to go through some of the basic troubleshooting to get your irrigation system back. And then what do you do with the results? How do you use that, and how do you integrate that into your watering system? So as we go through this, we're going to tell you kind of a basic guideline, but your field's unique from your neighbors, right? Everybody is going to do the irrigation audit a little bit different. It's not going to be cut and dry. It's not black and white for everything. So we have to be flexible. The best thing about these conferences is that you're going to meet a lot of people that can help you, right? You're not going to know all the answers. We don't know all the answers. So be willing to take that step and don't be afraid to ask for help, because you might know how to do an irrigation audit, but your network is still the most important thing, right? Y'all believe that? It's so important. I can't talk about it enough how important it is to talk to your neighbor about this stuff. So what do y'all see when y'all look at this image? What are these circles? Donuts. So a lot of people, I get emails a lot of emails, and they'll say, is that a disease? Well, it might. Diseases are circular in pattern sometimes, and if you don't have the experience, you don't know sometimes what's going on. But this is just basic irrigation management here, right? Basic irrigation audits can help us change that if we don't know what's going on. Uniform irrigation is a must. Do y'all see these donuts here's one. It's all through the field. So uniform irrigation is a must. It's going to start showing up eventually, right, if we don't do something about it. So I just think these photos, this is from North Texas. This is a school up near North Texas that had some irrigation issues. So when we go through this, we're going to think about what type of irrigation system do we even have. So when we start talking about audits, we're going to do them a little bit differently depending on maybe where we are. Some of us might have portable systems. Anybody have a portable system to water anything? Okay, so we're not only talking about fields sometimes. We want to look at other areas as well, right? So those can be moved very easy, but somebody's got to move them. We got to pay somebody to move it. We got to watch it. We got to go out there and move it again. So those might not be something that we want. We want an in-ground system. So less time, less labor. We're getting to the point where we can set those and almost forget them sometimes. We can control it from our phones and see what's happening. Anybody got that going on? So is it good, or do you love it? Do you wish it was the old days where you had to go check on it every day? Yeah, so we're getting better, right? We're getting more efficient systems. But the cons is the maintenance. A lot more maintenance can go into those systems. So when we're talking about efficient irrigation, we have 4 different components. First, we have to have the correct hardware, right? If we don't have the right pipes, the right heads, then we're already setting ourselves up for failure. Proper installation. How many of y'all have installed your own irrigation system? Ever? Anywhere? So sometimes we have to do it ourselves. I thought there would be more hands raised, to be honest. But great, then you probably really got it properly installed. You had a professional come in and install it. So then once all of that, do you think that's it? It's going to require maintenance, long-term maintenance, management of the system. Maybe you call in a professional to come get it maintained, or maybe you're out there maintaining it. So if we don't have these 4 things working together, then we're already setting ourselves up for failure. Why do we care about improving our irrigation efficiency? We just talked about water scarcity being a big problem in some of our areas, right? Depending on where you live. We want to reduce the water use. We want to water efficiently and only when we have to. We're going to have to go or less spot watering, less spot treatments, less water wasted. If we know that irrigation water is going into the ground, then we know it's not running off, then we're not wasting it. less need for fertilizer or chemicals if we're watering properly, and of course we're going to save money in the end if we do all of those things. Okay, so I know this isn't a golf course talk, but we pulled some information from environmental profile. Of course, this is very old. You know, it takes a lot to do with these surveys, so maybe there's a new one coming up. So we really this survey just wanted to get an idea of irrigation. Have we reduced irrigated acres on your golf course, pruning tree roots, all that type of stuff to reduce water use? But only 7% of these people that responded to this survey had a professional come do an irrigation audit. Is that surprising? Not really, but we need to start thinking about what we want to do. So, Coach O wants to know, Linda already kind of asked how many people in here have done an audit. So how many have done one yourself? How many had a professional come in? Okay. So after this presentation, we'll take another poll to see who's going to do one. Right? Did anybody watch the game? I'm a Clemson fan, but I went to LSU too, so I kind of won, but I kind of lost. But anyway, Charles, I think, wanted to troll me a little bit with all this LSU stuff again. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to Charles for a little while to do some of the next one.
All right, well, thank you all. So I think that from the golf course survey, you know, I'm always surprised at some of those low turnout numbers, but it seems like this group's a little bit more on the ball. It looked like quite a few of y'all have done those audits before. Kind of the first thing about any kind of irrigation system management is we need to kind of use our eyes and just observe how's it working. And before we start an audit, kind of formally, fix some of the obvious things that are wrong with it, right? And I'm sure y'all have seen all these things at various times at some facility that y'all have managed. Sprinklers, they can break, mowers hit them, what have you. Mismatched nozzles or having full circles and part circles on the same zone or something. We need to be, those are obvious mistakes and fixes that we can make. Leaks, sunken heads is a big one I've seen. Clogged nozzles, definitely. Are the heads installed at grade, but also are they level? So we need to make sure we take care of the obvious before we start worrying about doing an audit. So doing an audit on a system that we know is problematic doesn't make a lot of sense. All right, so we'll define what an irrigation audit is here first. Basically, it's a method of inspecting our system and then measuring how effective the sprinklers are, what's the output of the system on an individual zone or individual test area basis, all right? And the results then can be compiled and used in combination with just field observations. And then we can use that information to dictate how we manage the irrigation going forward. So in my mind, it's a fundamental part of irrigation scheduling, irrigation management. We can't do it without knowing what our system's doing. And here are some of the tools of the trade, right? Some of them maybe are more critical than others, but these are things you might use. Probably irrigation flags, right? We want to mark those out. That's going to be very important because we want to be able to visualize where everything is and where everything's going. Really important. Having a timer, but obviously if we're using a controller to do it, that may not be as critical. Pressure, we need to be able to monitor pressure. Okay, that can give us a lot of information about the nuts and bolts of how our system is working. A tape measure or a wheel tape, so we can get a handle on things like what's the spacing of our system. Maybe you installed it, maybe you already know all these things, but maybe you're coming to a new facility and you don't know what the spacing is. And so when we look at the spacing, we can match it up with the heads that are in the ground and say, does this make sense? We've got the pressure, we've got the head, we've got the spacing. We can make sense of things. So we have a calculator here, right? And some of y'all may use pen and paper and a calculator, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can also use things like MS Excel is a real handy tool for managing this sort of information as well. And then maybe the most important part of this is the old catch can here that we'll talk about a little bit more. And so when we look at an irrigation audit, the basic steps, and it's simple, right? You guys have done it. it's pretty straightforward, but there's a process, there's a procedure to it. And it starts with that site evaluation. Again, if we're going to do a catch can test on a system that we know is faulty, it doesn't really do us a lot of good. So we want to make sure it's working the way it should, at least from what we can tell visually, before we start the process. If we see something wrong, make those changes. And then we do the catch can test. Okay? And that's where we use one of these guys to try to measure the output. And we'll look at some more of that in a second. From that, we generate data. So with that data, we need to make some calculations. They're pretty straightforward. Again, Microsoft Excel and some other tools can help us put those together, make decisions. So we follow that procedure. You can do it on an annual basis, and every year kind of change the way you manage your system. Okay. So on the basic system evaluation, again, this might be your first time walking on a new facility. You inherited the place. You're trying to just figure out what's going on. All right. So you'll activate each zone, visually inspect for problems, make notes about the system design. Again, that's what type of sprinkler heads are they? What's the spacing? Anything about how the valves or the system is oriented. Make notes of those. Make notes of those. Make maps of those if you don't have them. Very good information to visualize what's going on. And then looking at, having access to your water meter, understand what your source is. Is there a meter? Is there a pressure regulator? Is there a pump? What's going on? Make note of what's going on there. And then once you've kind of established those basics, we can move to the catch can test. And this is where we get the data. This is really the heart of the irrigation audit. And the two goals or the two outcomes of that catch can test are listed here. And hopefully these aren't terms that are new to you, but if they are, we'll define them here in a second. We'll get a mean or average precipitation rate, and then we'll calculate a distribution uniformity coefficient. Okay? And so when we look at the distribution uniformity, that's just a characteristic of how efficient is my system. And there's several different ways to do it, but the most common way is this DU lower quarter. All right, that's the most common. And I get a show of hands. Who's familiar with the idea of a DU lower quarter in this room? Okay. So it's a useful number. It's an indicator, again, of how efficient our system is. And you'll see others maybe out there, but this is the most common. We can use that to maybe adjust how we run our irrigation system. That's maybe more of an advanced topic, but at the very least it gives us an idea of that efficiency. And so even if it visually looks like things are working, that can tell us, well, maybe it's not quite working as well as we think. And then the absolute most important piece of information, if you didn't already have it, would be your precipitation rate. That's your output. That's like if you're calibrating a sprayer, that's knowing what your output on your gallon per acre is. We're going to calculate that precipitation rate. So it is the critical piece of information you need to be able to set up an irrigation schedule. And we're usually looking for that to come out in something like inches per hour. All right? And so you can see pictured here, we've got an audit or a catch can test being run. You've got typically some sort of grid pattern that lays out those catch cans. You'll run the system and capture the water, and from that we can get the information we need. The catch can itself, okay? What makes something a catch can? Well, it's not really, I don't want to overcomplicate it. There are plenty of commercial products out there. Irrigation suppliers provide them. Universities provide them. Texas A&M AgriLife provides them. So they are available. You don't have to do a whole lot of digging to find a good source for them. And sometimes you'll see one thing to pay attention to is, do they come in units of milliliters or do they come in units of inches? And so some of the catch cans will give you milliliters, which is a volume. That's not necessarily directly useful for when we're trying to calculate inches per hour. It's an extra math step, which is fine. But some of them out there will give it to you directly in inches, and maybe that's a little simpler. But in reality, any straight-sided container can work. And a lot of times you'll see the old slides will talk about tuna cans. So again, we're just looking at something that's short and that we can quantify how much water is falling in that area. Okay. Here's some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves as we're going to set up our catch can test. First and foremost, how many do I need, right? How many do I need? And that's going to be dependent on the area, but we have a good number, a starter number that we can use. How should the cups be spaced? How long do I need to run my zone for a typical cycle or for the test? And then how many zones do I need to test? Do I need to test all of them, or can I just test one and move on? So some of the kind of the I guess the rules of thumb, basic guidelines that you'll see out there. You want to operate under typical conditions, but you don't want wind involved. We're not testing to see how the Oklahoma wind affects your irrigation system, even though I know it's going to. We want to test that system itself, and so low wind conditions preferably, because that's when we should be irrigating anyway, right? So normal operating conditions, and so that's really pointing to pressure. If you're irrigating during a time of day when, like in the evening maybe, when pressure is maybe higher than it is in the middle of the day, well then you need to try to, if you can, replicate that in your test, okay? If you're going to use catch cans, make sure they're the same type. Just be consistent, okay? Don't mix and match them. It's just better to have consistency there. But in terms of how many, you'll see that typically a minimum of 24 per zone is the recommendation. All right, and from that we can get enough data to have good information when we do our calculations. And so you'll see that cups might be 2 to 3 foot from a corner head, and then about 1/3 the distance between the heads on maybe smaller size systems. But probably more typical for y'all, we're looking at about 1/4 the distance between heads. So it depends on how big your field is and what your spacing is. But you can use these kind of ballpark numbers to really feel good that you've got a good grid pattern, that you're going to cover the area and generate the information that you need. Okay. In regards to how long you want to run your test, if you think about trying to catch water, and let's just use something like a rain gauge as an example, right? If it only rains 0.2 of an inch, okay, what's the difference between 1/10 and 2/10 in that little rain gauge? Sometimes it's hard to tell, right? So we want to kind of up the volume, where we get a little more precision to understand what's going on. All right, so we want to run it enough to get enough volume to tell what's going on. And usually the rule of thumb we see is that we want water to be about 1.5 times the throat area of the cup. Usually that ends up being about 5 to 10 minutes on a spray head, maybe 10 to 20 on a rotor type. So for most of y'all's fields, we're looking in between 10 and 20 minutes, but that depends on your field. If you've got a really high precipitation rate, you may not need to go that full allotment. But when I run a test for rotors, usually 15 minutes is a good starting point. And then if I feel like there's not enough water in the cup to be confident in what I'm measuring, then I might bump it up and try it again. There's no reason you can't do a couple of these, to feel like you have confident information in your test. The other rule of thumb you'll see is shooting for about 5 full rotations of these larger rotors. If you catch it, if your cup is catching it at, say, after 1 rotor turn, that's great. But I mean, maybe you got half a turn in there, and another head only got a full second turn, or one only had 1 turn. So we want to be consistent for all the cups. So make sure we have at least 5 full rotations. Okay.
So everybody feeling good? Y'all want to get up, like stretch or anything? Y'all sleep? Okay. So the next thing we're going to kind of do is just show you some some worksheets that you can find online just to keep some of that data that Charles was talking about, and maybe go back later and put it into your Excel sheet or whatever other thing you have. So STMA is a great resource. They have a tons of educational things online. Who has visited their educational resources before? If you haven't, then they have great topics on everything you could think of. They have something written about it. So sorry if this is a little bit blurry. We tried to blow it up so y'all could see it, but this is the basic site inspection. Remember the steps of our irrigation audits? First one was site inspection, site evaluation, right? So we want to walk through and what kind of grass do we have? What kind of soil do we have? What kind of sprinkler do we have? List everything that we know about that site. This is especially good if you're coming and you got a new job, right? And you don't want to rely on someone else's records. You want to go out and take your own and make sure you know what's going on. This is the time where you can say, my valve's messing up. I see high pressure in one area, low pressure in the other area. My sprinklers are raised over here. They're sunk over here. I need to go out there and make some adjustments. So this is a really good guideline to just kind of take some notes and be able to have that later. So that's one that we found. The next one is where you actually can put some of the information about your test area. So site, where are you putting the actual testing audit stuff? What is the pressure? How much did you run? What type of soil do you have? Why does that matter? Why would the soil matter when we're thinking about irrigation? Yeah, so if we have a sandy corner in our native soil field, then that is going to be a lot different when we think about the run times later, right? So that's somewhere where we can put, if we don't know, then we can take a soil test, right? But we need to know the texture of our soil for run times later. So this is kind of just another data map that you can use to do your audits. And you might already have a map of your sprinkler locations, and you can use that there to kind of put where you put the catch cans. Here's another one where when we were talking about calculating distribution uniformity, this is where you're actually going to go in and put the amounts that your water in your cans. So you write that each can. Maybe you have more cans than this. You can use a different sheet. But how long did you run it? What was the area of the catch can that you're using? That's going to be really important later, the area of the opening of the can that you're using. So this is a good sheet to how much did we catch in total. We're going to add all those numbers up, and Charles is going to show us some examples later with math. But remember that lower quarter uniformity calculation? This is where we can do that here. So how much did we totally catch? Then how much did we catch in 25% of that? And we're going to use that later in our calculations. So good note keeping. So STMA also has calculations out there for you. You just insert all the information you need. Don't get scared. We're going to go over a really easy example to show you how to calculate all this. You want to do it by hand. And so, of course, there are computer programs that can do this stuff for you, but it's always really good to know how to do it by hand, right? So you can check, because computers aren't always right. So this is our precipitation. So we're going to go over an example, but really easy. We just need the total catch volume. The device opening is going to come into here, the area of the device opening. And then eventually we will get down to our inches per hour of precipitation rate. So all of this is on STMA's website if you want to use that as a resource. Again, precipitation rate, we're going to go through an example in a few minutes. Here's our distribution uniformity. We want to maximize the distribution uniformity as much as possible. Anybody have an idea of what the ideal uniformity is for an irrigation system? Percentage-wise. How efficient should it be? It's never going to be 100, right? 70? 70 is pretty good.
70 is really good.
Really good. So 80% is generally that ideal range. And if you find one that's 80%, then it must be like brand new or something. So I'll show you some examples here in a minute of some real life irrigation distribution. So again, all of these things will go into eventually getting your run time per cycle. That's our goal in the end, right? We want to know how much we need to run our irrigation system. Why is that important? Why are we doing this? So have you ever put down a pesticide and that bag says, I need to water that in 1/4 of an inch? Well, if you don't know what your system's running, how are you going to water it in, right? That's why these things are really important. Okay, so these are going to be some examples, and some of these are really old. We got these from Dr. Richard White. He retired a couple years ago at A&M, and so we took some photos from him. So this is kind of a little case study. So anybody know where this is? University of Houston. Okay, so we did University of Houston soccer field. We did Texas A&M football field, Texas A&M soccer field. So this is an example of a gun-type irrigation system. Anybody have one of these? Everybody just has underground heads? Okay. So they have a gun system. This is showing that you can still do an audit with this type of system, right? So do you think this system's putting out more or less water than a normal one, normal underground system? Per hour, what do y'all think? Precipitation rate. Okay, we got same. I hear some more. We hear some less. Okay, there'll be a prize later for whoever gets it right. Okay, so this is kind of an old model of irrigation, uniformity across the field. So this is different. Well, get the laser to work. So these are like the yard lines on a football field. Sideline, inside the hashes, sideline. So it's kind of y'all kind of see how it's going across. Okay, so the darker blue up here is going to be more water. So we definitely have a pretty ununiform distribution of the water here, right? What do y'all see over here? Inches per hour. It looks pretty high, right? So we've got some parts of our field that are getting 1 to 2 inches per hour. We have some parts that are getting 2 to 3. Most of the field is getting over 3 inches of water per hour. Is that a lot? That's a lot, right? So we can tell, and there are better mapping systems out here right now. This is kind of the old way of doing it. We have more programs now that can show, it more evenly distributed over the field and better than, easier to look at than this. And I'm sure y'all seen those before. So anyway, we can tell that this field is not uniform, right? It's got some issues. Most of them are on this side of the field, okay? All right, keep that in mind. So now, Craig, this might be really old. I'm sure the fields are way better than this now, okay? Because Craig's the best, so. All right, we have some more uneven distribution. But what do we notice that's the major difference on this one in amount of water? It's only 1.5 inches max, where our last one was 5, right? So remember how we guessed how much it would be more or less? Way more water was coming out of that gun per hour than the underground systems. So we can tell that it's pretty uneven here too. We've got a lot more water kind of on the sidelines than we do down the middle, right? So these things are really helpful for just seeing problem areas in your field. Now this one is just on the same scale as the University of Houston one was. So remember how the University of Houston one was way up here? We're putting out a lot less water per hour. So that's just kind of to show you on the same scale, right? Okay, here's a photo. So we see our catch cans out there. Typical irrigation audit. So. Okay, now look at the soccer field. I don't know what year this is from. Okay, early 90s. So all of this is just to show you how different fields can be from each other. So we can see the wave that's happening in that field, right? some of the fields getting almost no water on this. So very interesting to see these maps. And sometimes it's more fun to see the maps like this because when we see the field, we can see the spots. But once we see that, we can tell how up and down it is. You're just like, wow, that field, how is it even making it in some of the areas, right? Yeah. So remember earlier we said we want to limit the hose that we have to pull and the spots that we have to water. This is one of those fields where, like Craig said, you have to pull some hoses, right? So that's going to increase your time and labor on those fields. Same kind of diagram earlier, so we'll skip that. Okay, so here we are. What does all that mean? Here's our average application rate. And this is just to show y'all how variable it can be. So University of Houston is putting out 3 inches or more per hour, which is a lot. Kyle Field was putting out at that time about 1/2 inch per hour. And then soccer field about the same. So that's pretty good. That's pretty good that they're very similar. But look at the differences in the uniformity. Below 50% in most of them. So that's getting down where it's pretty bad. And we could see that in those maps that they were not uniform. So like we said, 80% is ideal. That's very rare. I think that correct me if I'm wrong, but I went to grad school at Oklahoma State, and while we were there, we had to do irrigation audits on each one of our research blocks, and I think they were around 60 to 70% on most of them. So, even at a research station, where I'm not going to say that we have the highest maintenance, but we're still kind of in that area where most of the systems are going to be. 80% is really good. And relax. It's only math, so we're going to turn it back over to Charles. And
all right, thank you. Yep. All right, so it is really hard. I'll admit I'm not very good at figuring out how to do math problems in front of large groups, but we're going to try that a little bit. We do have, if we want to do a little more, if you have questions or want to see something different, we do have the little pad here we can write on. So please shout if you would like to do something like that. But we're going to go through the basic calculations you'll need to do for your catch can test, what to do with it, right? So we're going to bring back this worksheet, and there are other resources out there, but for this group, STMA's put this out there. At least give it a look, see if you like it. At some point, I think you'll want to go into really having your own Microsoft Excel kind of system that you figured out, you understand how it does the job you need it to do, right? But this is a good starter tool because it has, it asks for all the key pieces of information. So, and I generated some audit data, and basically what you would do in practice, right, is you would just put it into each of these blanks, similar to what we have there. We hit our 24 catch cans for our system. And so let's say we ran that system for about 15 minutes on these normal rotors, and we might get something that looks kind of like that. All right, and so we got a pile of numbers, and we need to know what to do with it. And so that's kind of where we're at, right? And we'll go back to this formula here. And this is the first step. We want to find out what our precipitation rate is, okay? And this formula is not very complicated. It only needs 2 numbers. I guess the first one we have to calculate an average from that data. Hopefully we can accomplish that. But basically you put your average depth over your run time times 60, and that gives you your inches per hour. Okay? This is assuming your catch cans are measuring in inches. Okay? Remember, some of them will measure in milliliters, and there's one extra step for those. Okay? So from that data I showed, I did an average. Okay? All right, and you can do an average. Once you punch these into Excel, to me that's the easiest way to do it. You've got it now long-term in a database. You can generate an average from that very easily. And so we might have 0.43 inches over that 15-minute runtime. Okay? And if we punch these numbers in, okay, you'll see that you'll end up with a precip rate of 1.72 inches, which is pretty high. It's on the high end, but not certainly unrealistic. And so from that now, we can generate our irrigation schedule. Okay. I put this slide up here just to show you. Again, if you have one that's measuring in milliliters, okay, you would get your catch can volume here, okay, instead of your average volume, and you'd have this one extra step where you divide by the area, and then ultimately you get back to an inches, an average inches, okay. And so in those cases, just one extra step, but you've got the formula right there if we wanted to run it, okay. So going back to our data set, we've got 24 catch cans here. And just to show you what you might do if you were going to make your own spreadsheet, all right, very simply, you would have a column here that shows those catch can numbers, those cup numbers, right? And then you just put your values right into that spreadsheet right there, okay? And then you can put a little function in there that says make the average of this column. And so this here would be that value that I gave you, the 0.43. All right? And then the next thing you want to do is you can actually take this and just copy it over. And I don't know how familiar you all are with Microsoft Excel, but it does have an option to sort. And so if you highlight this column, hit sort, and you can rank it by its value. So you can rank those from lowest to highest. And why is that important? Is because as we start to calculate this value here, this DU lower quarter, we want to know what our driest catch can areas are. All right? And so being able to sort those then allows us to very easily say, this is our driest area. And so, and because we're using 24 catch cans, we know that a quarter of that is going to be 6. So we need the driest 6 catch cans in order to calculate our DU lower quarter. All right? And so in this case, that would mean that this value here, 0.314 and on down, we're going to calculate the average of that and divide it by the average of all of our catch cans. Now, if you're only using 24 catch cans, it's not that hard to just come over here and find those 6 lowest values. And so we can do that pretty easily as well. We can see we've got a quarter inch here on up to the 0.31, and it's not that hard to very quickly scout for those lowest 6 values. But if you like Excel and you're able to use it, I'd encourage you to do this because, number one, it's very easy. Then you can save that data, and you can kind of copy-paste, and it makes your future audits to be that much simpler. Okay? All right. So DU lower quarter, if you all recall, was the driest portion of the field over the whole field. That's what we're trying to come up with, okay? So the first step is to get the average of these driest 6. And so if we average all of these circled ones, we'll get an average of 0.29 inches, right? You compare that to our average here of 0.43, right? So one piece of advice, this number should be smaller than that number. So just keep that straight. It's always good to just look, does it make sense, all right? And if it's not making sense, then you may have to start over. But so we've got our lower quarter average. We've got our total average, and it's simply a division, right? This 0.29 over the 0.43, and we get a 0.66. And so now we've got a precipitation rate of 1.72, a DU lower quarter of 0.66, and you can see I've put the formulas that I showed you right here into the spreadsheet, and so it's there. It's there, and you can see it. So in this case, the data is pretty decent filled, not perfect, but certainly reasonable. If you've done a good job and actually filled out this grid pattern in a way that represents your field, well, then maybe you could see, is there a hot spot? So if this represents the field, well, this half the field seems drier than this half the field. So maybe there's some observations there that you can make about what's going on, but certainly that's going to be specific to every field that we're talking about. Who has a question about this? Is this making sense? Who uses Excel on a regular basis? Everybody comfortable with Excel? Okay. It's certainly a tool that I encourage you all to use, and it's pretty straightforward. The math is really simple once you know how to get the formula in there. Okay. One thing that I did not put in here in the math was what to do with this precip rate. And so I'm going to go back to this slide because it's got it right here. The precipitation rate, or the, let's see. No, that's not it. It doesn't have it. Okay. So I don't have the runtime calculation in here, and that just was my my oversight. So we're going to do it on the, we'll do it right here. So we have the DU. We know our system's okay. Okay. The runtime, or the precipitation rate's 1.72. We talked about looking at one field might have 3 inches an hour, one might have a half inch per hour. Obviously, if we go out and put 10 minutes on one field, that's a lot more water than on the other field. And so we can't just go by that 10 minutes or what. We want more quantitative data. So how do we do that? Okay. It's always dangerous to do math on the fly. Let's see here. So 1.72 inches per hour. Okay. That was our precip rate. Okay. And Chrissy's going to talk about how do we define the amount of water we want to put out, right? If it's something like a pesticide application, the label might dictate it. But in other cases, we want to try to target what the plant needs. And so if we wanted to put out, say, a half inch of water, for example, okay, maybe that's our goal. All right. So that's our goal, half of an inch. Okay. Let me see here.
We have a runtime calculation on one of these.
Do we? Okay. We'll go back to it. The way I like to do them is, and there's a bunch, there's formulas that we'll pull up again, is that we'll have a half inch requires how many minutes? X minutes. Okay? Is equal to 1.72 inches per 60 minutes. Okay? And so when we set that up, we can see that and do a cross multiply and divide. Okay? We see that
should be 17.4.
Okay. So the formula is going to look something like this, right? It's going to be our target rate over our precipitation rate times 60. Okay? And so what was the value you got?
17.44.
17.44. Well, you're not going to do 0.4 minutes typically. But, all right, so I apologize for the math on the fly. But this is essentially what we're going to do. So from that system of 1.72 inches per hour, we want to put a half inch out. It's going to take us 17 minutes, okay? If our system was putting out maybe about, say, 3/4 of an inch an hour, what would we have to do to change our runtime? Yeah, it would be about double the runtime because it's about half of the precip rate, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. Certainly we'll go through some more. If you guys have questions, we can try to do some more back and forth and pull up that formula from earlier. Okay. Is this you?
I think so. Okay. So now that we have our audit results, what do we do? We have to troubleshoot, right? So when we think about irrigation system, obviously head-to-head coverage is ideal, right? Why? What do y'all think? Right, we want it to uniformly be distributed. What we've talked about this whole time, we saw some of those photos from earlier. It creates problems. So poor coverage will create problems. Why do you think head-to-head coverage might be lacking sometimes? Spacing. Maybe the shapes of our fields are kind of hard if we have limited options with spacing. This is where we think about contacting professionals to install, right? Or at least consulting a professional based on what kind of field we have. It's going to be different. Like you said, spacing is the biggest thing. And so, uniformity of coverage is often related to low pressure, generally. And so we need to know how our pressure changes based on what type of system that we have. And so we have two types of pressure. We have static pressure when the water's at rest. It's not moving, right? And then we have dynamic pressure where they generally call it working pressure. That's when the system is operating. What kind of pressure do we have? So when we think about static pressure, when it's not moving, how do y'all think it can change? How can static pressure change? Elevation, number one, right? So when we think about a water tank is going to create pressure from gravity, right? If that elevation changes, then the pressure is going to change. What's another way? Pump. Yeah. Yep. Time will. What is it? Peak demand time. Very true. So, kind of like Charles was saying earlier, pressure changes throughout the day depending on what type of system you're running, what kind of water source you have. So, static pressure, elevation, and pump are basically the ways that static pressure can change. What about dynamic pressure? How can the pressure change whenever the system's working? We just said two of them. So, elevation can change it, pump can change it. What else? Pipe distance, right? It's going to be something. Size, opening maybe, velocity of the system. Charles is going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but how maybe rough our pipe is. Somebody said how short it is. That's going to change dynamic pressure. But the length of the pipe's not going to change static pressure. The only thing that can change static is elevation and the pump, right?
Yes, sure. Yeah, so this was targeting more of a residential sort of situation, but the key thing I wanted to highlight is that when we measure, because a lot of times we'll measure the static pressure somewhere where it's kind of convenient, and that may or may not be near the sprinkler head, right? Every system's going to be different. And so what you have to keep in mind is that if you measure the pressure, say at your water meter or something like that, and it's a good distance away from where your sprinkler head is, everything downstream of that is going to pretty much reduce the operating pressure you're going to get. And so if you're right on the money for the ideal operating pressure, but you're up at the meter, you're probably going to be a little bit low once you get down the field, and that's an important point that you have to consider. We also talk about are you measuring at a point that's a relatively similar elevation, or is it going to be higher? If you're measuring at a higher elevation than your field, well, again, that might be an issue for you as well. So you need to be paying attention to those things and understanding how the whole thing's put together. So if we run into the situation where we have low pressure, okay, like so many things in managing a facility, we want to start with the obvious things, okay, and don't overlook them. I've had this happen to me plenty of times where that spot looks dry over there. Something must be broken. Well, no, someone just turned off a valve and we forgot about it. So that happens all the time. So take a look. Is an isolation valve or a backflow prevention or some other sort of meter, is it partially closed? Is it all the way closed? Those are obvious, but that's the first step. Okay, don't overlook those obvious things. And then we also look at debris depending on your water source. Filters and heads and nozzles can get clogged, and those are going to reduce pressure. And in some cases, it doesn't take a lot of debris to create a substantial loss of pressure. So pay attention to those obvious things. If those are all clear and you got a bigger issue, well, now you have to look at, is the piping engineered correctly? Maybe it was when it originally was installed, but maybe some folks have changed the heads that are there now, and it doesn't match, the system doesn't match now the output you're getting out of those new heads. And so this is where consulting and an irrigation specialist might be real important in saying, hey, here's the pressure, here's the piping. What can we do to kind of match the heads a little bit better? In some cases, maybe you can just change nozzles or maybe just change heads. Maybe it means changing how the zones are laid out, incorporating a booster pump of some sort. But those are kind of more advanced things that you're going to want someone on your side to kind of advise you on how to best deal with it on your field. So that was low pressure, but high pressure is also an issue for us, right? And this is, I really like this picture here where you see correct operating pressure, and it's filling in that semicircle real well, right? Pretty good. When we crank up the pressure or remove any kind of pressure regulation on this system, all right, where did all the water go? Where'd it go? Up in the air. Disappeared. So we get a lot more misting when we have pressure that exceeds the correct operating pressure of these sprinkler heads. They're designed to operate under certain heads and under certain pressures, and every head might be different, and so you need to know what that is for your system and try to have a target for it. Okay. And so there are pressure regulating is it's out there. It's not terribly. This one's a little bit easier maybe to solve, but you can have some options as well. Do you want to put a regulator on the whole system? Well, you can do that, but you need to keep in mind that the distance between that point and your field isn't going to cause an issue, right? Because we're going to start losing pressure as we get away from that point. So in some cases that might be a good idea. Some cases maybe that's not. Maybe we want to go to a regulated zone or valve or even pressure-regulated head. So those are options that are out there. You're going to have to figure it out for yourself what system works best for you. But certainly we want to try to target the right pressure, okay? All right, so we've covered a lot of stuff, but what's missing? Mullet. Good answer. There it is. There it is. No, we're talking about the system, but at the end of the day, just like I forgot to put the runtime calculation, we need to actually do something with this information. So Christie's going to talk about ET.
Okay, so like Charles said, now that we know what our system's putting out, how are we going to use it? So how much water do we need? What do y'all think? Loaded question, right? Depends on a lot of things. So we talked about being flexible, and everybody's site's different. So what's your name? Gary. So Gary and Gavin might be neighbors, right? And Gavin might water 3/4 of an inch a week on one of his fields. Let's just say that. And then Gavin might water 1.5 inches a week. But they might be in the same exact climate, same exact location. One might have different soil. The other one has different soil. So just because Gavin waters a certain amount a week doesn't mean that Gary should water the same amount. So we have to take all of our site into consideration as well. But the main thing we want to get to is estimating the needs based off of ET. So what is ET? What's ET stand for? Evapotranspiration. From what? Evaporation from the soil, transpiration from the plant. Okay, so we can do a lot of things with that number, right? So what we really want to get to is using those estimates of ET and then using our irrigation system and the information that we got to water more efficiently. Okay, so there's a lot of systems out there that will tell you the daily ET. The typical one, what's the typical in the South, kind of in Texas? Typical number that you would hear in Dallas is water, this is for a home lawn, water 1 inch per week, right? That number comes from the basis of the average ET lost that week is going to be 1 inch. All right? So that means they want to return the amount of evapotranspiration loss, right? But we know that that can change based on where you are in the state. It's very variable. We do see different numbers here, right? The state of Texas, you could be recommended to water a ½ inch a week up to 2 inches a week, depending on where you are, right? So it's very, very variable. In a perfect world, we'd all have a smart controller that calculated the ET for us, and we could set that we wanted to replace 60% of that loss every week. And that would be a perfect world, right? Does anybody have a smart controller in here? Base it on ET. Does it work pretty well? They're getting a lot better. When they first came out, they were kind of average, I'd say, but they're getting a lot better, and they're a lot more useful, right? Texas has one, Texas ET. Depending on where you are, your state might have one as well. You can pretty much look these up pretty easily online and get an idea. And so when we're thinking about how much ET do we replace, we don't need to replace 100% generally, right? Depending on how high quality our fields are. Does anybody want to say, if you irrigate based on ET, how much you replace? 60%? So 60% is the typical for high maintenance, or middle maintenance, I'd say. Yeah. It depends on the use. It depends on the traffic and all of that. So they have some guidelines out there. This is from Oklahoma. I took advantage of how much the Oklahoma mesonet was useful whenever I lived there, and I really miss it a lot. You can get a lot of things from the Oklahoma mesonet. So this is kind of a basic guideline for athletic fields. So you can see the different types of grasses. We know that the grasses do have different requirements, right? Bermuda grass is the one that has probably the least requirement based on what we're doing. So high maintenance versus moderate maintenance versus low maintenance. You can see that the replacements are different. We need to start worrying sooner if we have high maintenance fields. We need to start replacing the water faster than if we have really low maintenance areas. So ET irrigation can get really complicated, or it can be really simple. And so you just need to find out where it works for you. But what we want to get to with ET irrigation is not replacing the water when we don't need to. So he said 60%, which is a pretty good guideline, 60 to 70% depending on how used your field is for sure, and what soil type, right? So soil is going to be a big factor in this. We didn't talk about that today, but I'm sure you've heard some type of talk before on clay soils versus sandy soils and how much you need to water based on that, right? And so we have to take that into consideration too. And often most of our controllers you can put that in. That will be a factor that you can put in. So what else can we do? Charles?
I don't know if it was clear. I just wanted to highlight this. This is showing kind of how often you might want to irrigate. And so in this minus ½ inch for the Bermuda high maintenance, that means when you've had about a ½ inch of ET from the weather station information. So that's going to happen maybe over like a 3 to 4 day period. Okay, so maybe every 3 to 4 days in midsummer, you'd expect that a high maintenance field might need a little bit of water because we're trying to push growth to recover from injury. A lot of times it's not just a home lawn that's sitting there. But a lower maintenance field, you might be able to water once a week or once every 10 days if you have particularly a native soil and not a lot of use. And so that's kind of the idea behind this graphic. If you've got the ET data and you kind of know how dry you want it before you make that next irrigation event, then this is where that would be useful. And so the nice thing about thinking about irrigation in this concept is you can set your run time from your audit to be that ½ inch. And so you know that every time you hit that threshold, let's put that ½ inch back. And so it kind of simplifies that system. Okay, so what else can we do? Obviously, you want to water when it makes sense in terms of plant water requirements, but also operating when we can, when the wind is calm. If we've got grasses that are prone to diseases, we want to try to irrigate again early in the morning so that we're not creating a lot of overnight dew or overnight moisture to prevent diseases. And then obviously when we have games, they get in the way of everything we're trying to do, but you got to pay attention to that as well around practices, around games, etc. So you guys know when to water for your field. This one here is again from the golf world, but it just highlights some of the survey data of what superintendents are doing on their situation to conserve water, how to make irrigation more efficient. And the number one thing that they're saying is use of wetting agents. And so when we look at the use of wetting agents and this is a Tifway Bermuda grass at, I think it's half-inch mowing height, we can look at 1 inch of water applied and say that's pretty green, and that half-inch right next to it, and that's looking pretty ugly. But when we put a wetting agent on it, we get right back to where we want to be. And so the wetting agents have come a long way and are fantastic tools. If y'all aren't using them, particularly on the sand systems or a sand cap system, you've got to be using wetting agents, in my opinion. And you can use them essentially year-round to help with a lot of just moisture management in general in your fields. So really do want to promote that as part of a good synergy with your irrigation auditing. Plant growth regulators. Who here uses PGRs? It's definitely big in golf. We're seeing more and more sports fields use it. Good. I mean, it's just really useful for maintaining consistency in a lot of ways, but it also helps with this irrigation system. We can get more consistent irrigation response. We can also get better drought resistance, where in this little greenhouse study, Dr. Worley was able to show almost a week longer delay before things started to brown out. And so here's your PGR applied, here's your no PGR. And so they do reduce the ET rates, they do improve rooting, they do a lot of things to help with the plant. So I'm a big advocate of both wetting agents and PGRs as part of a comprehensive irrigation program. And then don't forget the basics, right? Who's ever core aerified before? Yeah, that's pretty important, right? So we need to do that, and then we need to use the kind of venting mentality of just helping improve that uniformity of moisture entering the soil, and doing that when we can as well. So those are kind of no-duh types of things, but we can't forget them. We're going to have a little summary, and then we can do some Q&A here at the end. So number one, you got to use your eyes, observe problems. Okay, you guys are all good at that. Don't forget it. Audit the system to kind of confirm or verify what you think is going on. Sometimes you may catch something that you didn't see just by visual observations. Make the adjustments and then repeat that until you feel comfortable with the performance of your field. And then finally, if you can implement some of these other BMPs to conserve water, but also it makes performance in general more uniform and moisture management a little easier in general.